I'm live. Looks like I'm live here. Let me bring up the screen. Okay. All right. One second. I want to turn that off. I don't need that open. Okay, folks. So we've got a few people here. Welcome to this Planets in Houses final class of this 3-class series on the evolutionary process of the planets, and then the planets in signs, and then planets in houses. So it's a streamlined way of really just getting these structures of Vedic astrology really burned into your mind, right? So we'll start today with like we always do, with a brief meditation. You want to sit with your eyes closed, take a few deep breaths. Bring your mind into the present moment, here and now. No past or future. It's good to remember that. As we feel that connection to the heart, as you inhale, you feel that depth of the moment, and you feel that upsurge of consciousness as you inhale, and as you exhale, you sink deeper into the present. It's the constant flux of masculine and feminine energy. Inhaling is energy, exhale is release. So I'll say a couple of chants The first is to thank our teachers and the teachers of this knowledge. And the second is to unify the energy between teacher and student so that the knowledge is conveyed clearly and received that way. Om Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwara Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sarviryan Garvavahai Tejas Vinyavadidamastu Mavid Vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Okay, so see, we have a few people here. Those who want to say hi, whatever you can. You don't have to. I'm going to share the screen. This is I already shared the manual. You should be able to see that in the comments, in the comment field on the live chat. So we're going to pick up where we left off. Again, this is the third in 3 classes. The first one, I went over these qualities of karma, the evolutionary process of the planets, and then again, how to understand these things. And then the second class was on the 12 astrology signs. I did that last weekend. Was supposed to do on Sunday. Was supposed to do this class, but I felt a little under the weather and doing it this week. So we're talking about the houses today, and there was some example charts. And so to understand really what the sort of trinity of planet signs and houses are, how they work, we have these evolutionary processes where these 7 channels of karma are evolving in us. You know, as I've said before, and the first part of this class was that karma is not just this abstraction like, oh, what's my karma? Was this karma? Da, 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 da. People use karma. They misuse the term that it's like something bad. Oh, I guess it was karma. Or karma's coming. They're going to get their karma, right? It's not some kind of punishment. It's the actions you've taken in all of those past lifetimes. But it's very specific. There's really only 7 types of karma. There's 7 types of karma. These 7 channels. The karma of the sun. And these are shared karmas of life. These are the shared experiences that we all have. We all understand what that is. We all understand what the moon karma is, the connection to the heart, the sun, the connection to our confidence and our vision, where we're going based on what we think is possible for us, which is based on who we actually think we are. This is the evolutionary process. What we have the confidence to do based on what we think is possible based on who we actually think we are is like the sun. We all share that karma. It has nothing to do with where it is in your chart or anything, or what house it rules and all, which we're going to talk about today. So again, at first we need to segregate these things first and understand them as separate principles before we then smash it all together. And this is what typically happens, is there's not enough discrimination and learning things correctly in the beginning. People jump right to the complicated thing. And they, well, I know my Venus was here and and this nakshatra and this thing. So what does that mean? And we don't even understand what Venus is doing, not just what it is as an energy, but that there's an evolutionary process with it. It's not just, oh, what makes me happy? This a bunch of buzzwords. It's a whole evolutionary channel of karma, right? So the first class and the evolutionary processes of the planets, that's what I talked about. So that we got very clear about what karma is, right? Because you have to start from the beginning. And it's not because they're stupid or anything like that, but we hear these things, especially in the West. These are Sanskrit terms. These are Indian terms. This is why they get confused, because in the West, we don't really have a concept of karma. As much as we think we do, we don't. It's a misused context. It's not just what comes around goes around, so you're going to get punished or something or rewarded. It's that you're a universal being. Your nature is not this world, this body, your actions. Your actions aren't even your actions, because you are not the actions or the emotions or the body. You're the spirit behind it all. And the karma of all of the past lives and all of that is the structure, the matrix into which you've been incarnated. You even see the same word, incarnation, karma, that you've been pulled down based on that in this unique form with these unique tendencies. Those tendencies are what's shown in the chart. That's why astrology even works. So again, this is why I say these things. People don't even know why. Why does astrology even work? Well, if you don't understand all of this stuff, all this backstory, then it seems ridiculous or weird or just like some crazy belief system. If you don't even know what karma is or what the planets are, what the grahas are, or who you are. Again, so ultimately, that's what it boils down to. You, in this lifetime, are an emanation of the karma, but not just any karma. Karma of 7 specific channels, 7 specific channels of karma. Right? These 7 channels of karma is your nature. And you are evolving through different lifetimes, not just in some way, but through these 7 specific ways. The karma of the sun, the karma of the moon, the karma of Mars, Mercury, etc. That's what the first class was about, was understanding that backstory first, and then specifically how each one of these unique channels of energy come through you. In this lifetime, Rahu and Ketu are modifying influences. They modify the 7 channels and show actually direct references to recent past areas of concentration, which is Ketu, and what's really getting developed in this lifetime, which is Rahu. So if there's a lot of planets with Rahu or Ketu, if there's a lot of planets with Ketu in a natal chart, then it's going to show a lot of connection to past karma. And a person might have a problem moving forward because they're really spending so much time on past karma in this lifetime, which is what Ketu is. The karma that incarnated. It could be a burden to us. We could feel burdened by that heaviness of past karma. If there's a lot of planets with Rahu, for example, there could be a lot of new karma in this lifetime where, again, there could be where the person is somewhat unburdened by a lot of the past karma because they're creating so much more of it in this lifetime. You can see my chart's a good example where all those planets are with Rahu. All these planets are with Rahu. This is my chart. You see there's a chart here where all these planets are with Ketu, the south node. So there's a lot of this like past history where there's a lot of energy being focused on that. My father had his Saturn Ketu as well. I can testify to his very much burdened by his past, especially family legacy and his relationship with his father and all this stuff that his whole life was dominated by that kind of burdening of the past. Even when his son with this Rahu in the first was like, hey, Dad, let's forget all that. Okay. Can you forget it? Okay. It happened. Yeah. You weren't that good when I was a kid. You were kind of mean. Okay. Can we move past it now? Because it's okay. Right. And so throughout our life, it was hard with my father because he still lived in that world. It didn't matter. And he lived in the world of punishing himself, at least relative to me. It was hard for him to have a decent relationship with me because I reminded him of all of his past failures, even though I wasn't even thinking about it anymore. I wasn't thinking about it after my mid-20s. And we had a connection, but then it was always sort of dragged back into that thing where he always wanted to like revisit, not just with him and I, but just with his father and his thing and all this stuff. Oh, you have no idea. He'd want to reminisce about all of life's pain and problems that he's gone through, mainly like with his father and his stuff, right? You can see this kind of K2 Saturn, someone can kind of live, they could be sort of burdened, and it's a debilitated Saturn. So anyway, just because I haven't talked much about the nodes, because we're going to look a little more deeply into charts today, and we're kind of bringing it together and bring it to a conclusion, we could also see that part of it. But again, the first class was really just about understanding these evolutionary processes, which are universal. And I say they're universal because those of you who've gone through my certification course know, and you've heard me say, again, whether I'm reading the chart of someone who has, Mars in Pisces with Jupiter, or Mars in Leo, or Mars in Aries, or Mars in Capricorn, these are all pretty strong Marses. Pisces is a little different, but regardless, I know that if the person is in a Mars cycle, or I already know it's a universal energy, that Mars is going to be evolving in that person this way, regardless of the sign it's in. This is still the shared karma that we all have with Mars. It precedes where it is in the chart. It precedes it. Because regardless of how it is in the chart, that evolutionary process is pure and transcends this lifetime. And what you can understand is that if someone has like a Mars, this very exalted Mars, very high degree, or Mars in Leo is quite powerful, Mars in Aries, like if you see a planet that is in a high dignity, it means that they've evolved a lot of intelligence with that energy over many lifetimes. So in this lifetime, that channel of karma, that Mars channel of karma is quite clear, or it's they'll be quite confident in using that, or whatever you would. There are ways to analyze the planets based on what's called the dignity. There are many. I've taught classes on what are called the Avashtas and other ways of understanding how to interpret the planets based on their dignity, which just means in this lifetime, that channel is obscured, or again, there are many words, delighted or alarmed or whatever. But that channel is still pure and still the same evolutionary process. It just means that based on a particular sign, like I just said with my father, his evolutionary process of Saturn is the same as mine, even though mine is in Capricorn and quite strong. Again, I was just even giving an example of it where I could let go of the past. Okay, Dad, it happened. The past. That's a strong Saturn. When Saturn is in a debilitated sign, for example, in Aries, one of the things about Saturn is that ability to evolve beyond just, again, the capacity for solitude, facing our fears, letting go of things, right? And so the evolutionary process is from excessive physical worry to material accumulation to worldly ambition, achievement to peaceful solitude without fear is the evolutionary process of Saturn. My father was really very stuck in this part of it. And he was more down on that lower evolutionary scale. And again, even the capacity to let go of things. As I say, he was burdened by that because this Saturn in Aries is still like angry and frustrated about all the injustices of the past. I'm not. I wasn't, even though he was the perpetrator of them. I'm like, Dad, it's over. Okay. Now we're here. Okay. I get it. I understand. So again, these are but it's the same. It's a shared principle. It's can you let go of the past and live in the present and let go of the fear and worry and guilt and shame, which is one of the lowest, which is one of the more psychologically damaging parts of a debilitated Saturn, is also that concept of shame. And how, again, what my father would do, even he tried a couple times when I was in my mid-20s or so, even after I was like, okay, let's just move past it, because I didn't see him for about 6 or 7 years from the time I was like 16 to like 22 or 23. I didn't go over. I didn't even see him. He was just out of my life. But by the time I came around again, I had gotten over it. I'd put it past me. But he would still try to drag it out sometime because he was still who he was. And he knew how to. What he would do is try to guilt trip me or shame my mother or do something to, again, this difficult, when Saturn is harmed, the guilt and shame of that he would project. So he would try to shame me because, again, if I would have said the things to him that he said to me, he would feel ashamed. But he would try to do things to shame me for like not coming around or not visiting as much, or that I'm doing this or doing that, and trying to shame me over things or guilt trip me. And it didn't work because you can't guilt trip me. I've moved past it. I know what happened. I know why it happened. So your attempts to guilt trip me don't work. And he would do it, and I would just say it. I didn't even get mad. And he would get mad. And there was always something about my father that was funny to me. And he'd get mad and start yelling, and I'd start laughing. I wasn't trying to laugh, but it was funny. Genuinely, he cracked me up by the way he would start yelling and it just looked funny. And it would make him more mad, enraged. And again, this is very much a kind of pathology with a debilitated pattern that's there. The person will try to guilt trip you, try to shame you. When it doesn't work, they get more angry. If you start laughing, it makes them even angrier, even if you're not trying to do it to be cruel. So again, this whole kind of thing but it's the same karma. It's just a very dysfunctional level of something that it's still Saturn energy. And the same thing that I would tell him with debilitated Saturn, with Ketu, is the same thing you would tell me with Saturn in Capricorn. This is the evolutionary process. It's still the same thing. And you would have to tell the person, look, you need to let go of the past and learn to thrive in solitude and introspection and and let go of guilt, fear, shame, all that. So it's the same kind of, quote, remedy, because it's the same process. It's just a different point in the evolutionary process. So again, you can even just see when planets are at that lower end of the spectrum. And this is just based on the sign. The dignity is just based on the sign. That's why planets and signs are so powerful. And that's why I started last week, after the planets after the evolutionary process of the planets, I talked about, just in a neutral way, the positive and negative traits the signs, and then putting those evolutionary processes in these signs. There's going to be support or detriment just based on the planets and the signs. And again, there are so many structures in place in Vedic astrology to analyze that. Dignities, and even the dignity then brings in a wakefulness or sleep, which is called the Jagrata Avashtas. It brings in a feeling, which are called Deeptati Avashtas. There are other ways of measuring how the karma feels to the person, how the person expresses it. So again, in a situation like this, where the planet is in its own sign, like you have in my case with Saturn, the Jagrata Avashta is awake, which means we're awake to what it's doing. Doesn't mean we don't make mistakes with it, but we're awake to those mistakes. When I see myself being cruel or punishing, it doesn't really happen anymore, but the instinct is there like anybody else. Somebody does something to me, I'm pretty far past that now, but especially when I was younger, wanting to strike back and wanting to be like, I know how to get you. And by the way, when it is powerful like this, you know how to do it because you're cold and calculating and rational and know where the person, how to guilt trip them because you've worked through this yourself. You've seen it in yourself. You've been guilt tripped and you know the difference between being guilt tripped and what that was. So again, you're awake to the lower qualities of that evolutionary process. When the planet is in its own sign, you're awake to it. You've gone through it. And by the way, you could do that and still misuse it, particularly if it's what's called a functional malefic. For Gemini, Saturn isn't. Saturn is not a harmful planet. It's a very intelligent planet because it rules the 9th house. So a Gemini person is not going to want to guilt trip people. If their Saturn is powerful, they're not going to do it, right? An Aries person, Leo person might, because Saturn is still a functional malefic where the energy might be very intelligent and wise, but it might be easily used for harm because the energy itself is not a Dharma energy. Gemini would more easily use Mars as a force of evil, you would say, or in a bad way when it's powerful. They have to be more careful with Mars energy because it's not a dharmic planet. It's one of these comma planets. So, but anyway, and again, so these are subtleties and nuances that I teach in my courses. I'm illustrating them though from this perspective because I know a lot of people, that's the thing about these very succinct ways of looking at things. You can simplify and then kind of build out a little bit, which is what I'm doing here to sort of contextualize what we've learned already. But so again, this Saturn, it's that same evolutionary process of understanding the sort of, I can see when people are trying to manipulate me, right? And when they're trying to guilt trip me or whatever, and it doesn't work. The other thing is that when you have these planets that are awake, I've already done it to myself enough. I've already worked through that stuff. And again, this is also what when you get this natural malefic that's really powerful, like Saturn in this case, that's one of the things about when these planets are powerful is they're very active. So no one can punish me more than I can punish myself. I've already punished myself for all of my own guilt trip, shameful things in my life. I know every shameful thing I've done. I know it. And I feel bad about it. I feel guilty not anymore, but I worked through it. I was like, oh yeah, this is what I did. Ugh. And so I've evolved, right? There's an evolutionary process around that thing where I'm not going to repeat it again, particularly with Saturn, because Saturn is where we feel the pain of what we've done and we feel the consequences and notice how people, maybe don't like us anymore because of what we've done or something. But again, even my father, I used him as an example, which is a good one, his Saturn and mine, that him even recognizing, even feeling the guilt trip, feeling guilty himself about what he's done, because it's still an unconscious energy. It doesn't stop him from continuing to do it. He would keep trying to do that same thing with me. Again, so in many ways, that when the planet is in that difficult dignity, when it's not awake, when it's asleep or unconscious, like it is here, like I said, my Saturn is in that awake state where it doesn't mean there's not the tendency to make a mistake, but you're awake to it over time. When it's in the difficult dignity, when it's asleep or unconscious, the person will have a very hard time not continually doing it. Even if they lose everything, they'll still have the tendency to want to do it, to want to guilt trip you, to want to do this thing when they get angry. Again, because it's in a debilitated sign of Aries. So again, you take the sign Aries, which in detriment, in a difficult way, Aries is about anger, frustration. Again, Saturn is debilitated there, the negative. It's impulsive, impatient, aggressive. So when the person gets angry, and Saturn is there in the debilitated sense, that they're going to take their anger and try to, like, who did it to me? Again, because Saturn is like, feels bad. Instead of being responsible for ourselves, we want to throw it on the other person. Right? So again, these are the nuances of the planets and the signs and how they evolve, and how these 7 channels of karma are still the same force, but it shows up in a different, trajectory based on that dignity and its relationship to that sign. And again, there's a lot of tools. Just this basic planets and signs are incredibly rich. And by the way, if you haven't gotten one of those readings that I talked about, where I talk about these 7 channels of karma, these readings have been very enlightening for people, where I'll take your chart and I'll talk about every planet in every sign, the Saturn channel, and the evolutionary process of the planet. The evolutionary process is this. It's in this channel. It's this channel in this sign. And here, how it feels to you and how you're dealing with the karma of that evolving force. It's very powerful to hear in this lifetime. But then once we get an ascendant, like I have a Gemini ascendant, so that's what winds up determining things like if planets are functional, benefics, or malefics, and brings in a lot of nuance. We're not going to get into all of that today, but we are going to talk about the houses that the planets are in. Not really what they rule, but you can keep that in the back of your mind if you know it. But I'm mainly talking about where the planets are in those houses, because that's also going to be very important, because it's going to bring that evolutionary force into that area of life, right? Like we talked about, in my case, the Saturn is also in the 8th house. So it's going to also bring that seriousness into that very serious area of life where there's death, transformation, danger, vulnerability. So Saturn is there saying, okay, we're going to focus on this, and we're not going to just turn away because we're scared or whatever, which is what Saturn can do. Saturn's where we're kind of scared. And 8th house is a scary place. So again, this is one of those principles where you like to see the planet that's motivated to do something serious to actually do it and not run away from it, for example, as a principle. But all these planets, the moon is in the 5th house, right? Mars is in the 3rd house. In my mother's chart, right, she has her ascendant is Scorpio. Saturn is in the 7th house. Mars is in the 6th. Mercury, Sun in the 8th, for example. Jupiter, Rahu in the 9th. Venus in the 10th. Moon in the 11th, right? So again, these are all areas where the planets share where their energy impacts the world and shows up in the world. So that's what the houses are. Each of the 12 houses. Before I do that, let me just take a drink. I see Frank is here. Hi, Frank. How are you doing? If anyone else is here and wanted to say hi or make a comment, you can do that. I'm going to take a drink. So I'm going to, As it says here, each of the 12 houses in astrology represents a specific area of life with both strengths and challenges. Here's a succinct breakdown of their positive and negative traits. And there's also an evolutionary process with these houses, which I'll be talking about as I go through it. I'll just naturally explain how those houses are also have these evolutionary processes. So the first house is actually about the nature of self and identity. The positive is confidence, self-awareness, individuality, and confidence in your identity in this lifetime. Negative can be self-absorption, vanity, ego-driven. And the other real issue with the first house is also what I call integrity, which is not losing yourself in your behavior. Because here's a way to understand it. Every person we've incarnated with a unique identity in this lifetime. And like with me, it's Gemini. With my mom, it was Scorpio. With others, they have this unique identity, which is it's the way you're processing life in this lifetime, how you're processing the world. And it brings with it an inherent set of strengths and behaviors that are just innate. And there are things that you just understand because you naturally see the world that way. For example, like with Gemini, right? It's naturally kind of social. It could be funny. There's behavior that's associated with every one of these ascendants, because you could see the behavior of the person through the first house. The behavior. And behavior is something we do for others to get people to like us. And it's an amalgam of these innate tendencies that we have authentically. But when we don't know ourselves on a deeper level, that we can be lacking in integrity and just think of ourselves and be attached to our behavior, not realizing underneath it all, we're kind of lost. Who am I underneath it all? Who is that Gemini person underneath all of that kind of behavior and fun? And, I'll listen to what people say and make a joke, or I don't know, whatever it might be. Or a Libra person who can be friendly, or a Aries person who could be, also kind of gregarious and confident. And we learn as we develop. Again, it's a natural kind of behavior, and we can learn to just be political with it and get what we want and get people to like us. And it's how we see things. And we're greatly rewarded for it because it's also very natural. But it can also be very much on the surface and be lacking in integrity. So it can be summed up, the first house, as something that, again, either has an integrity to it or phony energy. You get around someone and you can tell they're just kind of acting, that there's phoniness there. This is a first house problem. It's not ego. The third house is actually ego in the sense of desires and what the ego really is. The first house is not really the ego, because the ego is personal desires and things we want. In a very healthy way also. The ego has a reason to exist so that we can understand this world and figure it out for ourselves and not just blindly follow everything. That's the power of the ego. The lower quality is we just think we're of this world and everything is about what we think and our desires, which I'll get to. The first house is not really ego, but it can show up as this confusion around our identity, and we lose ourselves in the false persona that comes out through our behavior. So this is the difference when you get around someone who knows themselves on a deeper level. You might not know what it is, but there's something very trustworthy about the person. There's integrity. And you see that they behave the same way all the time. They're not performing for you. That's one of the biggest things that we notice. Oh, yeah, he's that way in public, but in private, he's this way. You know him this way, but he's really that way. Or this kind of thing where there's a facade, there's a disconnect between our behavior and our identity. So you want to understand this as it's a huge thing to understand about you and everybody you come in contact with. And by the way, that's the case with all of the houses as well. It doesn't matter that, well, I don't have any planet in the first house, so that doesn't apply to me. The houses are universal, just like the signs. You have first, second, third, you have all of these life lessons. It doesn't matter whether you have planets there. If you have a planet there, then that planet, that force, is then going to be expressing through that area of life. So it's going to light it up more. But even if it doesn't light it up more, that's still a part of your life. Like, I don't have any planets in my second house. I don't have any planets in my fourth house or sixth house, whatever. It doesn't mean those things don't exist. They exist. And the way we read them is through their rulers and things like that. But what we're talking about here relative to these houses is when a planet goes into a house, that becomes a major focal point of their life. Like you can see here in mine, there's all this first house energy. So it's been a major focal point of my life. And again, some people say, it's easy to say in detriment that it could be things like narcissism and other stuff, which it could be for sure, because there's a focus on the person's identity. But you got to understand, it's not ego. Ego is third house. It's this evolving identity and getting to the true nature of the person. And when a person has a powerful first house and a powerful identity, you'll notice they're not phony. There's no performance, there's no behavior. You're seeing the real person. And I mean, that's definitely one thing about me is definitely I've always been very transparent. Part of that is also because Rahu is there, the sun is there, there's so much energy there. I don't really know how to be phony. I don't know how to behave. Well, that could be I could stop the sentence there, but I would say I don't know how to behave to try to get people to like me or whatever. Like my emotions or whatever is going on is right up front. You see it, right? Again, for good or bad, it's not a judgment. It's just a reality of even something that you could notice. And that means something irritates me, something makes me happy, whatever it is, you see it. I don't hide it. I don't know how to hide it. I'm very transparent in that regard. By the way, that's the Rahu part also. That just kind of makes things very transparent. And particularly the first house is where you see the behavior of the person and you're judging and measuring people's behavior against what you notice is not honest. So this is really to understand what the first house is. That's really what it is. It's this self-awareness, this authentic individuality, which actually comes through in this state of like integrity. And we get around someone and we're like, I don't know, there's just something about them. And sometimes it's not that they're being inauthentic, because I get around people and they don't like me, or they don't have that feeling, or they might think I'm doing that or whatever. It's not always just a kind of, you get this feeling and it's legitimate. Sometimes there's just not good chemistry between people or whatever it might be, so but underneath it all, like the thing that you notice when you start to notice that people are acting one way in front of this person, like you'll see people be phony. Again, like one of the things that you can see with integrity, because it's very important to understand what this means. You'll see that a person who has a lot of integrity, they act the same way. They're always themselves, even if they're talking to the cashier at the store, their boss, their employee, a 5-year-old child, a cat. They're congruent. relatively speaking. It doesn't mean you use the same language with a 5-year-old that you use with your boss, but but there's an alignment. It's not all this phony behavior where you're sort of over pretending like, oh, yes, sir, to the boss. And then to someone who you're the boss of, you're like, oh, just do it. Or you're at the cashier. Come on, come on. Like, it's not like your behavior changes based on your status with that person. That's how you really see that integrity. And by the way, that, again, that's one of the things that we very much hold up as as a great virtue of someone, where we really trust them and we really like them, and we're like, yeah, he's always the same, or he's not phony. Even if we don't necessarily, even if the person's authentic nature is not very nice, right? We'll at least trust them. And again, this is another thing. There's trust, where you're getting the real thing from the person. And notice how much we'll tolerate if we know someone is being honest with us. Again, honesty, that's another thing. Honesty, integrity. So again, the first house, it's very important. And also for you to understand this. To understand, this is what self-awareness brings. And people are constantly, they don't know who they are. We don't know who we are. And because this is a big gulf between who are you really in this lifetime? Are you coming from that place of depth, of identity? And where are you on this spectrum of performing to get people to like, or to just to get something from people? Again, and again, it's this kind of overcompensation. We overperform for the boss, and then by the time we've done overperform to try to get the thing we want from the person, then we don't have any patience or tolerance for the one we don't want anything from, and blah, blah, blah. So again, it's very rich to understand what the first house is and why, in many ways, again, your life revolves around it. That includes things like if you're not doing meditations and spiritual practices, what do you think that is building? What do you think that is connecting? It's connecting your identity in this world to your true nature. And the more you sink beyond just the personality in this lifetime and all that stuff I'm talking about, and all the things of this world, the more you're going to have this integrity that's like, oh, okay, all of this is really, it's good. I need to interact with people and I like people. And it doesn't mean that you don't still, act the way you act. You still have the personality that you have based on the ascendant. It's not hard for people to see that I'm Gemini, because it's still going to be my behavior and personality, right? It's still going to be like that, because that is the identity. But what's the deeper identity beyond? And ultimately what happens is, as you process things through that first house, and there's, again, all the meditation and consciousness that brings you into the present moment, you also transcend all of the attributes of that ascendant, and you become more like the Atman, like the true self, not the self in this lifetime. This is also why eventually you start to see great gurus and teachers and people who've done a lot of meditation and all this kind of stuff. They don't have all of these jagged edges of personality that we have. But once you get to know them and you start interacting with them, you'll see their nature. Like, I've been around a lot of people that have done a lot of meditation, and you'll see their personality come through. When you first encounter them, though, there's just a very kind of calm, settled, connection, because they're coming from a deeper place. They're not just on the surface personality, but the personality comes out as you get to know them more, and you start interacting with them on that personal level. I have one, Swami friend who I've known forever. It's a female. She's got a Pisces ascendant, and she's got these planets also in Gemini. So we just kind of geek out on Gemini, and my Jupiter's in her first house. So she gets around me and she's like, and she's a Swami. So she feels that Jupiter, right? So these things come together. And so then, so people are still who they are, but that integrity of identity is the first house. So talk about this one a lot, because it's also transcendent in your life. So again, when planets go there, they support or detract from that. So when you get difficult planets in that first house, that could be functional, benefics, malefics, or whatever it might be, it supports or detracts from that. Mine is a mix. Mine's the only chart that has planets there. Mine is a mix, but mostly it's beneficial because the ruler's there. But Sun, Rahu are there. There's been a lot of very rocky and difficult paths to self-identity, but it's been a lot of energy put there because there's all those planets there. But very insecure and lost around and lack of confidence and all that stuff for a long time, particularly when I was younger. So the first house is where we're evolving that truthful identity. So the second house is about wealth, possessions, family that we're born into, and the family that we create later. So the evolutionary process of the second house is going from their, values and wealth related to things like money, and also even like our childhood values, the values we were raised in our childhood. Sometimes we just stay stuck in all of that. By the way, like my father, he was still like angry at the things that happened when he was a child, right? He stayed very much in a kind of childhood value system, right? Had a hard time moving past it, even with money and stuff like that. So it's the values that come, and the need to evolve those values into things like, instead of just the family we were raised in, again, the family we create, like you're here listening to astrology and whatnot, you're creating another family based on different values. So the second house is how we take that identity in the first, and that unique identity is going to have unique values, right? Like my values are totally different than the people that raised me, right? For example, by the way, my father's values didn't move that much from the people who raised him. He tried to rebel against it, but he was very frustrated and stuck in it. And by the way, it's the third house that this is the power of the ego. And the third house is to rebel and fight against those second house values, and often those second house people in our family that try to condition us a certain way. Again, maybe it's not sinister, but it's just we're raised in a family, and the third house egoist says, yeah, but I'm this person. This is my nature, and these are my interests in how I see the world in this lifetime. So the third house is actually the ego, and you see it can move us away from the truthful nature of the first house into the desires of the third house. So the first and third house have this struggle with ego or identity. In between the two is the second house of values. What do we value? And how have those values evolved over time? And again, how we value ourselves and what we value also shows up in our money and our values. So one ways that our values also evolve over time is like when someone starts to have children, for example, then their values change. Like I never had children, so I didn't have to. So how I earn a living and my money isn't based on having to make as much money as I can to support a family. Once people have the family, that becomes their values more than anything else. Is I need to provide for these kids, so I need to make as much money as possible. So money and values become inextricably linked. When you don't have kids, for example, they're not as linked. They're linked to your own personal values. At least money is. So you'll see people put their personal values aside to raise a family and whatnot, and then they'll return to their personal values later after they've raised a family. But it revolves around this concept of values, money, and again, so resources, other people. So you see in the positive, it's financial security, resourcefulness, stability, those stable things. I want a stable job. And these long-term values that are stable. Like with me, the thing I wound up making a good living at is things that had been stable for decades by the time I tried to make a living at them. I had been doing meditation, studying, and knowing these teachings for 20 years before I ever tried to become an astrologer. So by the time I started to do it for a living, I wasn't going to waver. Or even when I talk about these things, it doesn't matter in what context I talk about these astrological things. It's always coming from that same stable place, which is where it started with me. I don't forget, oh yeah, that's right, we're, spirit and consciousness and all. I don't like somehow forget that and just kind of launch into a bunch of disconnected details. Those of you who study with me know that, because it's embedded in me that way. That's my value system around this. And you can see it. So again, but that's what the second house is like that kind of bedrock of our life, which is really all pervasive. In the negative sense, though, it can be, materialism, greed, attachment. So again, this is where we can get lost if we're not connected to our values or a deeper value system. Then the value just becomes money or something external and tangible. So again, the concept of values is an abstraction. Money isn't. It's something where we can be using that money and earning that money in a way that's in alignment with what we value the most. And that's what we're all trying to do. In the 10th house, we're trying to work hard for that money because it's an Artha house, what's called a house of Artha or wealth. And the highest Artha is that work in the career, where our values are how we are impacting the world and how we're making money. But we might lose ourselves in that. And like I said, the other thing to really understand is when we do things like have a family, especially have kids, our values change. So this is often what happens is people put their personal values aside for a while in order to make a lot of money to raise the kids, because the kids become another, but it is still Artha. It's another value. The higher value becomes the kids, not your self-expression. So I talked about the third house already a little bit, and it's very important because it's where we can kind of lose where we mostly live through our ego. You've heard me say this many times. As much as it feels like we're our true self, usually we're not our true self. We are our behavior in the first house. Most people are their behavior in the first house. The first house is their behavior, and their identity mostly revolves around the ego and the third house, which is their desires, right? In a positive sense, it's curious, articulate, adaptable third house, where we're trying to figure things out. In the negative, there can be gossip, restlessness, shallow thinking. It's literally the ego. So the evolution of the ego is to go from just defending our individual ideas to transcending those individual ideas and aligning them with a higher purpose. So again, because we're so in the ego, so in the third house, it's like a ubiquitous thing. It's like the fish in water. We're so full of ego 99% of our life. We're hardly ever in the higher qualities of the first house. It's usually the behavior of the first house and the ego and desires of the third house. I want to get this thing, and here's how I have to behave to get it. I want this thing, third house, and that includes, I want people to like me. I want to be happy. I want to avoid problems. I want to keep getting things I want. So how do I get them? Well, I act this way. Here's how I act, first house on the surface, behavior, to get what I want. I want this thing from the boss, so I act this way. I don't really want anything from that person, so I don't have to act anyway. I want this here, so I act this way. Now, again, I'm being extreme, but we're doing some version of that, right? So the deeper quality of the third house is not just our desires. It's figuring things out and looking and using discrimination to try to understand the nature of things. Again, including first looking at it comes from the second house of values. The third house is where we say, yeah, but I don't share those values. This is what I think is valuable. And next, it's because I want these things. So again, there's nothing wrong with the ego, and there's nothing wrong with any of the things I said. It's only wrong when we don't go deep, when it's on the surface and it's unconscious. So when it becomes conscious, we desire wisdom. We desire higher truth. And most of you here wouldn't be here if your third house wasn't questioning your desires. So congratulations, you're one who has gotten off the hamster wheel a little bit, But understand, most people haven't gotten off of it all. And maybe you've gotten off of it, a lot, but you even need to be careful saying that we've gotten off of it. We get off of it for a while, and I include myself in this. But then we get up and we get ready to eat or do something like this, and we're right back into it. We have to constantly be vigilant to the third house and the ego, because it's always drawing conclusions, saying things are right or wrong, good or bad. It's the ego operating based on our desires. But in the highest sense, it's opposite the ninth house, where we question our dogmatic beliefs. And that includes the dogmatic beliefs that we were raised in. That's why I'm saying in the third house, we question what we're being told. So again, our parents try to guide us. Oh, you should, this is the way it is, and da 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 and blah da 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 da. And it's all these ninth house philosophies. Sometimes it is ninth house, like religion or whatever. But we question ourselves and say, no, that's not the way it is for me. And we argue, and we need to figure things out for ourselves. So the harmony of the third house is harmonizing the third and the ninth house. Ultimately, then the third house becomes a great source of courage and strength to understand things properly and correctly and overcome just blind faith and dogma, which is the ninth house. So again, in the positive sense, it's curious, articulate, adaptable. Again, where we're listening, learning. In the negative, there's gossip, like you say, restlessness, wanting overstimulation, shallow thinking. To this end, right? Like I have Mars here in the third house, so again, means I've obviously always been ready to kind of. Mars is where we're ready to fight for something. So I'm ready to fight for things that I think are right. Again, got to be careful, because that third house could be arguing and fighting, and Mars is there. But it also gives a kind of love of things like competition. The third house, we have to realize that, and again, even with our ego, we like our ego. There's nothing wrong with, I'm not trying to judge it when I say it, because ego gets a bad term, gets a bad, reputation. We don't have to, it's not meant to be harsh. We like our ego. We like our desires, and it's okay to like them. We like what we want to do. And we have to be careful of the negative quality, though, like fighting others over it. But when you get something like Mars in the third house, or the sun, or one of these planets, even like Mercury, that enjoy things and is playful or competitive or something, it can be quite fun. Like the reason I really love sports and competitive sports. Again, this is a great channel for Mars, actually. Mars in the third house, it's one of the best places because it really gives Mars something to do. Mars really wants to do something. He wants to get in there and compete and fight about something. So let him get out there in sports, a tennis court or something, pool, anything, and fight. Now, again, it's a game, though. He's not there, in the seventh house where you're now fighting with a partner or something that's really, harsh. Now, again, it can be harsh. And, if people argue with me, like I'm not a good person to argue with, because I can be really ruthless. When I was younger, even now, I've learned to not do it. I've learned to not argue as much as possible. And to channel that, right? But it's very easy to channel something like that. And again, it's in Leo as well. Very easy to channel Mars energy into physical activity that's empowering. And so when he's in the third, or Mercury or Jupiter or the sun, those masculine planets especially, they can support that. Now, fourth house is the home and emotions. Positive is nurturing, rooted, emotionally secure. Negative, overprotective, clingy, emotionally volatile. So it's home and emotions and deeper feeling. So again, all of these interests that we have in the third house go into the fourth house, go into the heart. And then we keep some of the interests, and some of the interests we let go of. We don't follow everything that we're interested in. You've had many interests in your life, but for some reason, this one, like astrology, has really stuck, right? It's gone into your heart. It wasn't just on the surface, it kind of went deeper into the fourth house. That's what the fourth house really is, the way to really understand it. Third house, we have all this curiosity. We're adaptable. We're looking for new ways to understand things. And then in the fourth house, it goes into the heart, becomes a source of, we gauge how something feels in the fourth house. So, for example, you have a lot of interest. Again, there was astrology, there's this, there's that. But a lot of them ultimately didn't make you feel so good or so connected. Or maybe certain teachers or certain ways, or you're really interested in a thing, but then certain, again, teachers or ways of doing it doesn't really go into the heart. So you don't want any more of that. That's really the entry point into the fourth house. In the negative sense, overprotective, clingy, emotionally volatile. But we have to understand something. The fourth house is also what we're used to. So this means that if we're used to emotional volatility, like when we were raised in a difficult family, or we're used to difficulty, we have this emotional patterning for things to be difficult, then we can gravitate toward that. This is why when there are difficult planets in the fourth house, I don't have any here. Difficult planets in the fourth house is going to habituate us to expecting that things are going to be difficult, and we'll gravitate toward things that are difficult. That's why it's hard to break cycles of abuse, because abuse becomes something that feels normal to us, and our emotional state becomes volatile. So we're trying to evolve the fourth house from this kind of emotionally clingy and stuck environment where we're just stuck in our emotional environment, both in the moment and in our life, right? Where we're, where we're stuck, especially in a negative loop, to just the normal everyday kind of, fourth house is just wanting to feel that stability. And again, even like in our home, notice how we bring those volatile emotions or positive emotions into the home, right? You see the connection to ultimately being connected to the heart, where there's deep love and trust and devotion is really the deeper quality of the fourth house, and it's where our interests create emotional peace and nurturing and security. If we're interested in things that create negative emotions, then we're just keeping it going. And again, this day and age where we live in a very third house kind of overstimulated world, the constant on the phone and stuff is very third house overstimulation, and it creates a feeling in the fourth house. That's why so many of us are restless and anxious, because we have so much information and stimulation, and it goes right into the fourth house and creates a feeling whether we want it to or not. So we need to nurture positive types of interests, which nurture a positive emotional environment. And again, this is why one of the great things when we become interested in spirituality and meditation and doing those things, and even taking the energy of Mars, and instead of getting out there on the tennis court or something, we take the courage of Mars to reflect inward and bring stillness and peace. Then we bring stillness and peace into the heart, and we become grounded in that. So I'm going to step away for a second. If you have any questions or comments, you can do that. I'll be back in a second. Okay, so continuing with the fifth house. So again, these houses also they also build on each other. From the fourth house, feeling in the heart, we create something in the fifth house. So we're all creative, whether we know it or not. We're creating something. Again, many times the fifth house, it's said to be children, this kind of thing, but we're creating happiness and our sort of heart's desire in the fifth house. And that heart's desire is, again, that thing we love. That's really what a child is. This pleasure, I should have edited that. It's really our heart's desire is the way to look at it. Pleasure is a different thing. So we're really creating the things that we love the most. Ultimately, the fifth house is where we create ourself on the highest level. This is why it's even called twice born. If you've ever heard me quote from this, or if you've ever looked into even the astrological texts, the guru calls the student twice born, because when you're learning knowledge, it's like a rebirth of yourself. But the other way that we have a rebirth of ourself is we give birth to a child, right? That's also a rebirth, giving birth to a child. And we have that heart's desire and love and passion and beauty wrapped up in the fifth house. But we have to understand that we create that fifth house from the fourth house, which is whatever is in our heart. We are creating something. If we have pain and suffering and anguish in our heart, like I said, if we're habituated to this idea that life is hard, then we're going to create that everywhere. We're going to create it because we love it. Again, this is a very difficult thing for people to kind of think about, but notice, when we've all been there, we've all done it. We've all been indulgent before with this, oh, it's so terrible, oh, my pain, and we just carry it around, and then we spread it and create it everywhere. Because on some level, we kind of like it. We like to indulge sometime in the negative, dark emotions. And when we do, we create it everywhere. When people have children, they notice what they create because the child reflects it back to them very quickly. And the child starts repeating back the things that they picked up from the parent, and the parent is like, oh boy, I want to clean this thing up because I don't want this thing I love to pick up all the negativity that I'm creating. It may just be that they just noticed it. So the fifth house is also all of that awareness and transformation and intelligence and dharma that comes from the thing we love the most. Because that's really what the fifth house is, that thing we love the most. We love the fifth house. We love our children the most. Eventually, maybe we love our teachings the most. We love God the most. We love the beauty of the cosmos the most. And when we do, we create that too. Sometimes we just love creating music. We love the beauty of that kind of thing, like that beauty, and that all of that is also fifth house. So again, fifth house is one of the most rewarding, probably the most enjoyable house in the highest sense, not enjoyment, stimulation of the ego that I was talking about, but that dharmic fulfillment of our true heart's desire, where there's true love for something or someone, hopefully something. Someone, again, as long as when it's not possessive, it's fine. When it's not desire, but again, the fifth house is also not the desire. It's the actual love behind it. So again, positive is creative, joyful, passionate. Negative, self-indulgent, dramatic, attention-seeking. That can also be one of the things with the fifth house, particularly when you see it in lower forms of like art and artists who become like, look at me, and they can take that beauty of the thing. And by the way, even people with their kids, again, not to be negative, but let's be real to some extent. And again, it's not to be negative at the parents or like it's wrong to do it. People are like, oh yes, and they just kind of get self-absorbed. We can get indulgent and self-absorbed with our fifth house things. Self-indulgent, like, yes, like the narcissism of an artist. Oh, I'm the tortured artist and I love it and I'm creating that. Again, you want to just try to see these things as neutral parameters, even though and we still get a lot from it. This is why we become indulgent, because we feel inspired by it, even when it's something that might be difficult. Like I said up here, even if we have that negative emotion in the heart, we're going to create that in the fifth house, and that can be our heart's desire. Our heart's desire is to just be the dramatic tortured artist. I've sort of been there as well, a little bit. And you see, I actually have the moon in the fifth house. So, when the moon is in the fifth house, there's definitely this love of being creative, because the moon is our heart. It's like what gets us feeling alive is really what the moon is. That feeling of being alive. When it's in the fifth house, it's like, again, like the feeling of life. Life feels like being creative and inspired. Life feels almost kind of like a child, not necessarily the innocence, but the creativity. Like, oh, I could create that, like, right? So we really love our fifth house and the fifth house ruler. Whatever it is, whatever your ascendant is, that fifth house ruler is the thing that you really love. So, so that evolutionary process, though, is to evolve beyond that worldly form, because, again, many times artist types or people with their children, their whole life revolves around their children at some point, because that was their heart's desire. And then beyond that, they don't know, because, again, there's a biological sense of meaning and passion that gets hardwired with our kids. It's biological. But then the kids grow up, and after a while, they don't need us doting over them and all that, and people can feel lost. Well, what's next? What's my heart's desire now? Again, the fifth house graduates into the ninth house of God realization and Dharma, and that next level of Dharma. So evolving the fifth house from things that are personal, like my personal creations or my personal, like children, they're mine, see what I did, look at my kids are the greatest ones that ever exist. It's like, okay, all kids are beautiful. We love them. And they're like everybody else. They're going to grow up and be obnoxious adults. So, all right. I enjoy it too, but get some perspective. We lose our perspective on the things we love the most. By the way, that includes romantic partners that we really love. It's not the one we marry, it's the one we love. That romantic, oh, that's my baby. So evolving that beyond the personal to the transcendent, and finding that heart's desire in things that are not just for us and our experience. So then the sixth house is, as it says here, health, work. Positive is disciplined, organized, service-oriented. Negative is overworked, overly critical, health-obsessed, or sick. So in many ways, the sixth house is that repository of difficulty in life, where things are going to be hard. So that child that we have, we love that child so much, it's our heart's desire. Okay, that's the emotion that we have for the child, but is ultimately what the child does is it teaches us our capacity for service and hard work, because we're going to have to serve that child, not just be inspired by it. And by the way, that's one of the things about art and other things and other kinds of creativity. There's also that hard work and also spending your money and being of service to your art and your creation. But in some ways, it's actually much less ambiguous. And one of the reasons why when people have powerful planets in the fifth house, they actually don't want children is because of that realization. I can definitely attest to this. I've never ruled out the possibility that I might have kids one day, even now. I think even now that I'm like 60s, I'm like, maybe have kids now. It'd be good to kind of kick some life back into you again. I'm not opposed to it. I don't know. I'm still young and healthy, and it'd get me re-fired up. But then I'm like, you know what? I don't know. But So I've never ruled anything out, but I also, the prospect of like channeling all of that natural creative heart's desire, because I don't need to look for anything to inspire me, right? Because the fifth house is where you just feel it. Many times the reason people want kids is because they're like, all right, well, what's my meaning? What's my purpose? It really snaps them into a sense of purpose. That's the emotion, but then all that hard work comes in. And there's a kind of shattering of illusions. You don't have it the same with an artist, like someone who is creating music or something. Like, it's actually a beautiful, it doesn't make it more hard or more difficult or spoil it. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it spoils the love of a parent for children, but it kind of, because it kind of, there can be a lot of, for example, a lot of parents resent their kids and the work that it took and all the sacrifices that it took. I mean, let's be honest. We can talk about the inspiration to have the kids is the fifth house, but then you have a child and you're still inspired, you love them, but then it's a sense of duty and hard work and effort. And after a while, it feels like it's thankless effort. Again, that still teaches you something that we're meant to learn, that service and what we're capable of in the service of what we love and our heart's desire. That's the lesson really of kids more than anything. It's the hardest thing we ever did, but it was the most rewarding, right? But it's also a shattering of illusions. Many times with people who are like artists, and especially if there's a good relationship with it, it doesn't have that kind of sting where a musician never really ever minds working hard for writing songs and stuff like that. It's always just beautiful. Actually, there was an interview I heard years ago with the guy, his name is Bob Geldof. He's the guy who eventually wound up doing the Live Aid. He also played in the Pink Floyd movie, The Wall. He's the one who played Pink, the rock star. And he was in a band called Boomtown Rats back in the late 70s. And I saw an interview with him where he was talking about, he had just gotten married or something, or had kids or something. And it was one of these talk shows, like in America, we have a talk show, like it was like Mike Douglas or one of these very anodyne talk shows. And he asked him, hey, I noticed you had kids. What's that like? And he gave an incredibly brutally honest answer. And I remember it at the time. I was like 15 or 16 or something. And he said, he was like, well, it's good. You know, it's not what you think. And he's like, I know it sounds terrible to say, but as much as I love my kids, they don't give me the same kind of reward that even writing one of these little songs does. You know, writing one of these songs, it's just such a beautiful thing. Like, I create this song and it's just so unambiguously beautiful. Kids, you know, they take a lot of work or something to that effect. I'm framing it this way, but that he said something to that effect. He was like, oh, okay, that's surprising. He was very honest about it, about that particular thing. And I remember thinking, that's right. I'm sure that's right. So anyway, but the fifth house is the sixth house is very important with being of service to the things we love. And understand that sixth house service means that we're going to allow that thing we love to grow and to perpetuate. And when we don't do the service of the fifth house, of the sixth house, we turn that fifth house person into an enemy. That's also why the sixth house is related to enemies and bad health, like bad health of the relationship and all like that as well. So we need to be willing to be of service to the things we love and be of service to everything that we need to be of service to. And that includes all hard work. For example, eating the right food and doing all this effort. The reason people don't do spiritual practice is because it's hard and it's unpleasant. It doesn't feel good. We don't like it in the moment. It's unpleasant. Who wants to eat the less amount of food and sit in a room by themselves with their legs crossed and breathe? And we don't want to do that. Our ego doesn't want to do that. We want to have the mind run wild and eat more food than we need and have it be delicious and be lazy. That's what we want. And eventually that creates health problems. If we're not willing to suffer and sacrifice a little bit in the moment and be of service to what we know is right, then we're going to suffer later. This is why the sixth house is also these health problems and whatnot, because we know what's right over time. And again, by the way, the fifth house is also that creative intelligence where we've learned through life and it makes us intelligent and we know what's the right thing to do, but it's hard to do it. And the sixth house is where we have to do that stuff that's hard. It's easier to do things that are hard in situations where we love the person or the thing. Even then it's hard, but it's very hard in things that we don't love. Like, for example, if I don't love you and you bug me, I don't have any problem just arguing with you, fighting with you. That's also sixth house and making an enemy of you because I don't love you anyway. Why should I tolerate any crap from you? I don't love you. Who do you think you are? See, we're very different through our ego. And the sixth house is where we realize over time, yeah, but I don't want to be making enemies and I should be able to love this person. Again, loving a child, loving our creations, falling in love with our heart's desire, and then having our heart broken humbles us, makes us humble. And we learn, okay, why am I being nice to this person who wound up being mean to me in my mind? Why am I being nice to this person and mean to this person just because I don't want anything from them? I can be nice to everyone, even though it's hard. It's hard to be nice to everyone. And I'm not saying I'm there by any means. It's hard to be nice to everyone, particularly all the time. But sixth house is where we learn that it's not only the right thing to do. We don't want to create enemies. We don't want to be obnoxious. And we're willing to be of service even to the divine in that other person, because ultimately that is the highest spiritual lesson. When we're living through our ego and our sense of separateness, we're just, I'm me, you're you. I'm here, you're there. I don't want anything. I don't need anything from you. So why should I tolerate any of your crap? So I'll just burn you and go on. But again, just the energy around all that stuff, which is very normal and typical for the ego. Again, how much of that is our life? This is why when I say things like we live 99.9% through the ego, that's what I mean. Just typical, normal, everyday stuff. It's very enlightened to not do that. Now, again, as we get older, we don't do it as much. But again, we're also not as engaged as much as we get older. So that lesson of the sixth house is to be humbled and then to learn by being humbled, like our kids do, by other situations do, that we don't have to make enemies. And eventually, if we do these things, it also creates health problems in us and difficulty and stress in our. So then the seventh house comes where we're dealing with other people. Again, the sixth house is before, where we recognize that heart's desire and that love, and how that love teaches us that we're capable of being humbled. And now we're capable of taking that love for others, like the love we have for our kids and the love we have for our creations and our heart's desire. We're capable of taking that into every relationship in the seventh house. It's not just about our romantic partners, but this is also where we learn that. Partnerships, relationships, positive is cooperative, harmonious, committed. Negative is dependent, overly compromising, conflict averse. So in the highest sense, the seventh house is about those agreements. I get this, you get this, and it's even and fair. But of course, they don't feel fair. They always feel unfair. Especially the more we get involved, the more complicated the relationship, the more is the possibility that it's not going to be fair. And the more triggered we're going to be because we're doing this and we expect this back. And it's legit. Again, all of these house lessons these are all karma lessons. You incarnated to go through all of this. That's why I say whether they have planets there or not, you've incarnated to go through all of these things. And a planet in one of these houses is just really activating that part. And so these relationships, these agreements, again, the more complicated they are, the more volatile they can be, and the harder they are to stay cooperative, harmonious, to stay committed, because we're going to maybe find where we just can't tolerate that.
It's usually some level of behavior from the other person and how they deal with the, with the relationship, or what they bring out in us, where we just are like, oh, this person is just too whatever. Or certain habits or whatever it is where we don't want to make that agreement. So the biggest thing about the seventh house is owning our part in it, because the seventh house is where we are naturally pulled into trying to make the other person happy, but we're making the other person happy for what we get out of it. It's because I want the connection with the person, because I want to have sex with them. I want them to like me. I want them to hire me. I want something. Or, maybe I just like them and I want them to like me back. So I'm going to do things to get them to, and we act like we're doing some heroic deed. We're not. We want the connection. So we try to engage. And many times, again, as we get older and even when we're younger, it's authentic. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that, because we find some beauty in the person. Maybe it's not just physical beauty. It's also intellectual beauty. And again, as we get older, it becomes more refined, particularly relative to relationships and whatnot. We realize no matter how pretty the girl is or handsome the guy is, underneath it all, we're not going to get along, so it becomes less attractive. And so again, it becomes a more nuanced thing, even in romantic partnerships, but even as it relates to business agreements and other kinds of things, learning how to engage with other people and be fair in your agreements is what the seventh house is about. I mean, and even in this context with you and I, we have a seventh house agreement. You gave some of your money so that I give you this. You get this, I get this, right? And we're happy with it or not. And most of the time people are. But, again, I have K2 in the seventh house. So it's a thing that I've learned from the very beginning. I've noticed how agreements work. And I've gotten good at them, right? And again, you can't, for example, be like an entrepreneur, for example, and also have a decent business if you don't understand how to find out what other people want and give it to them, and what you want and get it back. Again, and have everybody win. Again, this is the real benefit of seventh house, ultimately, is the kind of win-win. Again, when it's not good, a person tries to take from the other person and thinks, well, that's a win. I win when I get everything I want and you get nothing. But eventually we realize that's not a win, because you're going to create resentment in one, and you're taking advantage of someone. There is no win. So the seventh house is that mutual consent agreement that feels good to us. We want the other person to enjoy receiving from us, and we want to enjoy receiving from them. Right? So the seventh house is those agreements that are by mutual consent. If I got to take it from you because I'm stronger than you, that's not an agreement. By force, then the seventh house is out of alignment, right? Or if I think that I'm giving, but you're not giving back, or I'm not appreciated for what I give, or whatever. Again, these are the things why these agreements become harder. It's easier, like on this level. You gave me some money, I give you this. We don't have to do anything else, right? I could just make it worth your while, and you make it worth my while, and we're good. That's not that complicated of an agreement. If you had to sit here and I had to talk to you and engage with you on 1,000 different levels, okay, it might get more complicated, and I would charge more money for that, which I would, because it's more complicated level of engagement. And I would filter through who it would be and what. I wouldn't just invite anyone. Again, this is also why more complicated levels of engagement, even business-wise, requires that someone pays more money. And if you're going to get more of my time, you have to get more. And I have to see that you value it. See, this is also why, even like with money and energy exchange, they have to be commensurate. Like, for example, I have certification course, which, it's up around $1,000 or something, but it's a year long. There's a lot that people get, but they got to pay for it. If it wasn't enough, if it wasn't more money, people wouldn't even trust it. So again, this is all part of seventh house stuff. Like, people wouldn't trust if I said, a year's worth. You get all this for, $10. You would think, wait a minute, something about that doesn't seem right. $10. It must be garbage, right? So again, this is why I'm using this money and even this as an expansion of the frame, because we tend to think it's just having a romantic partnership. It's an exchange of value and what feels fair, what feels reasonable, and what we're suspicious of as well. Like, I don't trust that. Over time, we start to learn what's trustworthy as well. So again, evolving that seventh house is from really identifying what we need in an agreement, being responsible for ourselves, and being willing to accommodate and cooperate with the other person. But also ultimately, in the highest sense, the seventh house is, we also need to be able to walk away from it. We can't be clingy and dependent upon the other person. This is, or the relationship. This is where seventh house agreements go down the drain, because when we lose ourself in the agreement, then we wind up projecting and blaming the other person. Or if we're so locked into our own identity, and we can become afraid of now opening up to someone because we're afraid we're going to get abused again, or we're going to have all of this, because we don't trust ourselves enough to have good boundaries. These are kind of the same sort of issue. But sometimes, again, and people over time, really with the seventh house more than any other place, people just kind of shut that whole thing down. I don't have relationships anymore. There's a good reason why, to some extent, because spiritually, when we develop, we become less dependent on at least romantic partnerships. But if we're shutting down all interactions, like business agreements or any kind of entanglements with people, it's because we don't trust ourselves once our desire to connect comes into play. So we're trying to evolve those agreements so that it's mutual respect. And the eighth house is very connected, because the eighth house is where we become vulnerable and we feel the vulnerabilities in our partnerships. So the seventh house, we make the agreement, and even just to be kind of, very intentional, it's like where we're like having the sex, or we're having the engagement. We're doing the thing in the seventh house. The seventh house is where we're doing it. Whatever it is, we're engaged. The eighth house is afterward. We're like looking at, this is now I'm noticing where I'm vulnerable. I thought it was going to be this, but it's this. I can't control this part of the thing, and I feel vulnerable, It's a similar thing to the fifth house. We had the baby. Oh, I have a baby. Oh, it means all this work. The seventh house is, okay, I have the engagement. Let's just, again, be adults. Okay, now we're having sex and we're deeply involved, and that's great. I'm so connected, not just because we're having the sex, but we're having the connection and the emotion. This is what I wanted. And now it's like, oh, and there's also this. I didn't know that. These secrets, this vulnerability, this part of the person. Okay, there's that too. Okay. And in Scorpio, it becomes where we realize how vulnerable we are also. Even if the other person isn't doing anything, we become aware of it. We become aware of how vulnerable we are because we get triggered, right? Sometimes it is something that the person does, but this is also why it's very important as you get older, and we do this naturally. We're more careful with people before we jump in and start having sex, for example. When we're younger, we don't. And those those eighth house qualities, did I say Scorpio? I'm actually talking about eighth house, excuse me. Those eighth house qualities that come after the seventh house engagement. Seventh house, we're, having the sex. Eighth house, we're feeling vulnerable. If we do that sex thing too fast, or we're like, oh, I love the person, and we don't, then, but this is how eighth house This is why we become more cautious as we get older. Because when we're younger, we're not. We just jump right in and follow our hormones. And then we deal with the catastrophe of, wow, I didn't even know this person. And I felt like I was going to die. I was destroyed when I found out they were seeing other people, or when I found out they were like this or whatever. This is why our first heartbreak experiences are traumatizing. We all remember the shattering of illusions, and it felt like you were going to die. Those early romantic disappointments and disillusions. And even if they did nothing, even just our own jealousy, like we love the person and we're so like blah, blah, and we see them talking to someone else and we get crazy. We're just nuts at first. So 8th house is that thing we can't control. That's the biggest quality of the 8th house, is the things you can't control. So again, positive is transformative, deep, resourceful. Negative is controlling, secretive, obsessive. So we try to control the situation because we don't have control over certain things or over really much of anything. The only thing we really have control over is literally our awareness, what we're willing to agree to, how tolerant we can be with what doesn't feel right, how much we can give and feel good about giving, where we're not willing to give. Again, we have control really just over our awareness. We don't have control over the other person, but we can ask and expect mutual feedback and all of that stuff. But after that, the 8th house is the part where we can get paranoid and triggered by everything the other person does. And we can get jealous about it. We can get obsessed over it. But again, that's just a model on the surface. Underneath it all, the 8th house is all the things we can't control, all the agreements we have, all the illusion of control that we have with all the people. Like, okay, I'm this person in this world with other people. And that's the way life is. I'm this person who has relationships with all these people. Yeah, and then someone dies. That's why 8th house is also death. It's not just romantic partners. We feel it there, but we feel it with all the people in our life. And one of them dies. And we realize I'm vulnerable. I don't have any control over any of this. I could lose everything. So who am I? I'm going to die too. Now what? Well, we can just try to control everything and live triggered, paranoid, and fearful, or we can go deeper into the transformative, deep. And it says resourceful. That's decent because it has to do with like other people's money and shared resources in a mundane sense. But the deepest shared resource and sense of value is that collective awareness through like meditation and all these great teachings that we have, that we're not just the body. So like I said at the beginning, again, a lot of the negative qualities of the 8th house are important because it is a difficult house. And we come to the positive ones through the negative. For example, someone dies, or we become obsessed, or we go into these spins in the 8th house, and then we find a higher source. Then we find a deeper answer. So transforming that vulnerability into a strength, transforming that fear, again, into spiritual strength, and the willingness to let go of our illusions and our fears, and the courage to develop ourselves is the evolutionary process of that 8th house. As you see, I have Saturn there, so it's helpful there, doing that type of work. See, my mom had Mercury's sun. She also had the 8th house ruler in the 8th house. And she had a lot of, she had a lot of changes and transformations and abuse when she was younger. She came from that era where husbands beat their wives and stuff, and my father did that, right? I grew up watching that. And again, this is why my father had a lot of guilt about the way he acted when he was younger, but nobody else cared. Like my mom, she didn't hold any of that against him either. She was like, we were young. That's the way it is. He never let go of it, but she was able to deal with it and let go of it. She's got that 8th lord in the 8th house as well. Intelligence about those vulnerabilities. And even again, those things that people have done to us that can make us fearful and scared to ever get involved again. That wasn't my mother. She went out and she dated again and had other, and then she wound up getting married to someone for the last like 30 years of her life. Right. So she still trusted and understood, okay, this is what happened. Right. So again, we move through that and we go to a deeper level of consciousness through the 8th house rather than just being crippled by our insecurities. But the thing that comes after the 8th house is also this 9th house. And my mom's a good example. And the 9th house is philosophy, higher learning. In positive, it's expansive, adventurous, open-minded. And the negative, it can be dogmatic, impractical, reckless. Again, the 9th house is like what we believe, our belief systems. And again, they can be just sort of religious and dogmatic, but even that's going to help us. It's better than not having any belief system. At least it can be. It's better for us. We enjoy it more, even when it's a bad belief system, even if it's something that's ultimately really kind of dark and negative and ugly. Again, like racist ideologies, all ideology has a connection to the 9th house. So they can be terrible. But for us, it actually gives us a support. People that believe, again, like let's say in white supremacy or all kinds of terrible beliefs, it gives them hope. Again, even though it's twisted, it gives them hope. And now they just need to get a better belief system. They need to just eat better food, get a better belief system. But again, so the 9th house, when planets are there, it gets us hopeful about something. And you can see like with my mom, she has this exalted Jupiter here. So she's got this 8th house ruler in the 8th house, also with the sun. But then she's got an exalted Jupiter in the 9th house. So she's got that exalted planet, and it's right on, it's very close to the degree, very close to 5 degrees. So my mom, underneath it all, even though she was abused by her husband, by the time my mom she wasn't even 20 yet. I was born 11 days before her 20th birthday. She had 2 kids and a husband, smacking her around and being abusive and cheating on her and all kinds of other stuff. Wasn't even 20 years old. That was the world in 1963, right? It's sad to think that that's the world. And she was living back, where she grew up, which is, very rural Maryland, where there was no resources. This was the mid 60s, right? She could have given up. I mean, for one thing, it was kind of more normal back then, as terrible as it is to say. That was kind of normal. But then by the time she got to her by the time like the early 70s, this was when women's liberation really started in America. And this is kind of when women started rebelling against that and getting divorces. Not that many. My mom was like one of the first, because back then you couldn't even get a credit card without your husband, a bank account. You couldn't do anything without a husband's signature and all this stuff in America in the early 70s. In spite of that, my mom did it anyway. She snuck off behind my father's back and learned how to drive. You couldn't get a driver's license. It was, somehow she got the signature, but she had her friend teach her how to drive. She planned out this whole thing. 8th house, very strategic. She's like, I'm not just going to be a victim here, which is the transformation of the 8th house. I'm not just going to be a victim here. I'm going to go deeper into this and have courage to transform and change my circumstances, which she did. But she also had the hope that if I do this, and it was dangerous because, again, back then your husband could beat you up and all. I mean, there was no laws against anything that could happen. But she was a tough lady too. A lot of courage. Again, Mars and Aries, right? But so again, she had this Jupiter in the 9th house as well, which is like, I have hope. I have hope that this is going to happen. And by the way, she did it because us kids were still young, and particularly with me, my father was hitting her, beating her up whenever he was angry. But then he started beating me up a lot too. And that's when she was like, I'm not going to have my son also like terrorized by this guy for what? His whole childhood getting beaten up like this. No. So she just took it on, right? And plus, she didn't like it either. No, anyway. So, but you see, this 8th and 9th house. It can be this very like survival stuff in the 8th house where we realize we're not in control and we're vulnerable. So we need a higher what's next? What do I believe in? What's my lifeblood? And again, my mother was very spiritual, not religious in the sense of going to church, but very faith inspired. She always had pictures of Jesus and believed in God and all of that. And that got her through. I'm sure I was too young to remember, but I'm sure that got her through because it got her through everything as she got older and as I was able to notice. But so again, the 9th house comes after the 8th house because we have that crisis of like, oh my God, I'm not in control and I could be killed and who knows what could happen. And I'm scared to do this thing, but I have faith that I can get through it. Again, that's a higher quality of the 9th house. Is those philosophies, that higher learning, which again can just be something like religion, or just a belief in God. In the negative, though, it can be sort of like you say, dogmatic, where we just kind of have blind faith in things and it's unchecked. And the reason I talked about the 3rd house the way I did earlier, the positive quality of your ego and your 3rd house is that it questions these philosophies and questions these dogmas and makes these dogmas more practical. Because the 3rd house is where we do something, where we actually do it. We put it into practice. We get out there and question things. We compete. We argue. But again, in the 3rd house, we can just stay stuck in the ego where there's no grace flowing. And all of our individual ideas are just for ourselves and our own desires. They need to be aligned with the 9th house of these higher teachings, philosophies. So then all of those individual ideas become connected to a higher purpose, which is what the 9th house is. So planets in the 9th house give that higher calling and give that higher philosophy and sense of meaning. So again, when someone has planets there, particularly if it's Jupiter or something, even though Rahu is also there, again, that complicates it, but it actually shows that she's really developing a lot of new ways of seeing things in this lifetime. It made her not so religious, but more spiritual in that context, but very driven by faith and seeing things as a test of faith. And just also, again, the 9th house is where we sense that there's a bigger picture. And one of the things about my mom is she always, after parents did get divorced and all like that, she always kept a higher philosophy in mind and modeled that, whether we knew she was doing it or not. I noticed, even though I didn't realize I was noticing, that she was always keeping a philosophical high ground and a gracious sense of purpose, especially as it relates like to my father, relative to me and how we watched him hit her and be mean to her, be mean to me, just be a bit of kind of a lunatic, just a crazy, like tantrums and ranting and throwing things and scary guy. And I didn't like him. And I used to say, I don't like him. I don't want to go over there anymore. I hate him and blah, blah. And what he does to you. I mean, I didn't hold back, right? And she didn't deny me saying those things, but she would say, Sam, your father loves you. He does the best he can do. I remember the words, even though I could barely remember anything from then. Even now, I can remember sitting in the car looking at her saying this stuff and saying, Sam, your father does the best he can do. And he loves you. And I know you don't understand that, but, just try to remember that. And I'd be sitting there like, after what I just saw him do to you, because that was the thing that would make me more angry than anything. Of course, I didn't like the stuff he would do to me, but watching him like yell at her or yell at us about her and all this stuff was just nuts. And I hated it. I have to sit there and listen to him like yell about how my mother was a whore. I mean, just crazy stuff. And you're a kid, or just all this not crazy stuff. And I hated it. It'd be really make me angry. Aside from, and and I would say it, and she'd be like, he does the best he can do, does the best he can do, keeping that like focus on the higher purpose, the higher teachings, that ninth house, like just understand. And it would have been very natural to just even complain a little bit, like, yeah, he's a real crazy man. I know. She wouldn't even say that. I mean, it's quite remarkable. This is why I also know kids can survive divorces and stuff. When the parents rip into each other, that's what's difficult. And what it does is it turns the kid against the parent who's being mean to the other one. And so again, but this Jupiter in the ninth house, I mean, that's like what an exalted Jupiter would look like. And no one taught my mother this. I'm sure of it, because I know where she came from. This was just this was just her. She just had that capacity to, when the occasion comes, to rise above it. And again, that's the power of the ninth house and the power of Jupiter. So having exalted Jupiter in the ninth is going to bring these things together, right? Even just Jupiter is that high-minded, virtue to see the bigger picture of what's going on. Like, this isn't going to benefit anyone to have my son hate his father. So and by the way, it wasn't phony. She really meant it. She really didn't. She would just he would scream and she would just stand there like, she used to call him Gep. She would just go, Gep, just cut it out. Like, and take us kids, while he's screaming at her about how she's a whore and all this stuff. It's just like, anyway, I'm laughing at it. I mean, it's just really, it's crazy stuff. So anyway, but interesting to see. And again, you can see this Saturn K2, he's got Jupiter, Mars. He's got Jupiter in Pisces. It's with Mars. I don't know the ascendant. I don't know the rising sign. But again, this furious, debilitated Saturn in Aries, very close to K2. And you see it was on my mother's Mars. So, she wasn't afraid of that. She'd be like, yeah, okay, you're debilitated Saturn screaming at me. I got Mars in Aries. Like, she wasn't scared. She was like, whatever. And she's also got that Mercury Sun in Gemini. She would kind of laugh it off a little bit. Like, he's nuts. Yeah, I know you don't understand, but one day you will. Like, let's go. So again, way above her time, because even the culture didn't support anything she was doing. Nobody was getting divorced and doing this stuff back then. So anyway, these 8th and 9th houses, they're so pivotal relative to things we're doing spiritually and facing our vulnerabilities and transformations. And everybody has these stories in their life. I showed you mine here with things we can't control and the difficulties and like being vulnerable and seeing drama, chaos, uncertainty. To me, it was just, I was angry, but it was also just terrifying, awful time to see this going on. Right. And so again, it evoked my like ninth house, my tendencies, which again, for me, I have, again, that Saturn in the 8th house. This is where I was like noticing, like, people are crazy. I can't depend on any people. I got K2 in the 7th, which is like, all right, people are crazy. I can't depend on them. And then Saturn in the 8th house is saying, okay, I'm trying to get a handle on this and, trying to survive it at the time. Yeah, there's a survival quality. But he's also the 9th house ruler. So I was absorbing those lessons, even though I didn't really know it at the time, because I remembered those things. And I'm sure there was something about my mom who knew I would remember, because she was modeling that behavior. And I remember all of those things when she was gracious. I remembered them. I don't know why, but I mean, I probably because it was shocking. And kids will remember stuff like that. So anyway, that 8th and 9th house, though, where we go through vulnerability and we're called to rise above it with some kind of philosophy. Very pivotal, because that's where we're moving into that next stage of the soul's liberation. because now we're not just about this person on earth, we're about letting go of our fears and preconceptions. So then the 10th house, again, it says career, public image, ambitious, responsible, authoritative, negative, ruthless, status obsessed, overly serious. Definitely the 10th house is about our work, our duties, responsibilities, and handling the pressure of life. And ultimately what we want in the 10th house is we want our work to be reflective of our teachings and of our philosophies. That's the most rewarding work, or at least not be against them. And, I said earlier that our values change. Like, for example, when someone has kids and whatnot, our work often becomes a thing where we're just trying to make as much money as we can, and our duties, responsibilities, and whatnot takes on that value, which is fine, because that it's worth it for us to work hard and sacrifice for that cause. And again, that cause is also our philosophy. Like, now I'm taking care of my kids. That's my sense of purpose, and I need to work hard in order to do it. But again, once people start getting to the point to where they realize that, or really even while they're doing it, people can get confused about wanting to do something that's more in alignment with their teachings and making a difference and whatnot. They're trying to bring those 9th house philosophies into the career, right? But in another sense, the 9th house is also things like higher learning, such as, education. And we often just get a career based on our education. But again, that's a very entry level. As our life education continues, though, we want to spiral that upward as well. Person goes to college and they know that it's a good career choice to learn about, tech and IT and all this kind of stuff. So they go and they get a job in that thing, and then they work at a company, and it's in alignment with what they've learned, but now they keep learning throughout life, and they learn about yoga and meditation and other kinds of things. And they imagine that they're also doing that kind of work where the value they give is in alignment with the teachings and the life lessons that they've accumulated. So this is always what happens. So many of my readings and whatnot revolve around this. So again, it requires that kind of true inspiration. You need to be truly inspired, right? And willing to work hard and sacrifice for those things. But again, even if we're not doing it in our job, ultimately, the 10th house is not just about the job. It's really, again, public image, public contribution is also a huge part of the 10th house. The 10th and 11th house are very connected in this way because they're both about the difference that we make in the world. The 10th house is like the power we have, and the 11th house is what we do with it. Do we compete with others, or do we serve something higher? They're very close, but they're different because, again, the 10th house is literally the power we have. Like at any given moment, we have a certain amount of power and a certain amount of willingness to work hard to either gain that power or let go of it and get a different kind of power. And that's depending on our ambition. What do I want to do with the power is more the 11th house. So the 10th house is the capacity and willingness to go for the thing and handle the pressure. Again, another big thing, pressure. What am I willing to be pressured and inconvenienced by? That's why entrepreneurs succeed, because they're not just trying to be comfortable in themselves, which is the 4th house, opposite the 10th, but they're willing to step outside their comfort zone into a public place to say, I'm this person doing this thing. I can tell you it's scary at first, even though people think, oh, well, Sam, you have all this confidence, whatever. I didn't have any confidence. I didn't do what I did because I have confidence. Nobody has confidence in the thing they haven't done yet. And 10th house is that willingness to step up, whether you have confidence or not, and handle the pressure that comes with certain duties and responsibilities. right? We feel confident doing it based on our education. Okay, I feel competent to do this. But what about that next thing? That's where it gets tricky for the 10th house. Because again, it's now the power we have. Now I'm declaring that I'm this person. And this is what I'm going to do with it is the 11th house. So I wanted to say this because many times, like for example, when you follow gurus and teachers, you'll see that there's a lot of people around the gurus that do a lot of seva. They do a lot of service. Many times they have careers that are separate. But then the contribution and their public life and their ambitions and their responsibilities actually don't revolve. I mean, they fulfill the duties and responsibilities at work, but they're really lit up by their responsibility and handling the pressure of like doing all this work, which again is 10th house, for the guru. You know, like when my guru Amma comes, there's an army of people that are volunteering. None of them are paid for any of it. And they work tirelessly to have those programs go. They're not paid for any of it, but they're public. Everybody sees them and knows who they are, but they go back to regular jobs. They're not defined by the job. Their 10th house impact is the service to the guru, for example. So they satisfy that 9th house philosophy of those gurus' teachings in their 10th house work, even though they're not paid for it. So I'm telling you this to uncouple these two things because they're different. And they're willing to get outside their comfort zone and work hard for the guru because it's in alignment with their teachings. And also this 11th house. Again, it's a very public thing. 11th house is very much about, it says friendships, community, visionary, collaborative, humanitarian, negative, detached, impersonal, overly idealistic, also competitive is the 11th house, where we're competing with others rather than being of service to others. So in the 11th, like if you keep that 10th house model, and let's say that a person just keeps trying to advance in their career and getting ahead and making more and more money, getting more and more fame, making more and more of an impact in that way. No judgment, but just say that's their career choice. And it's just based on advancing and rising in life, regardless of whether it's in alignment with their teachings or not. Eventually, they will be checking this to see if they're selling out. But let's say they're in that phase where they're perfectly happy to just keep taking on more and more responsibility to make more and more money and having more and more power over more and more people, etc. At each stage, let's say they were at this stage, in order to get to this stage, they have to have the ambition, which is the 11th house, to compete with everybody else to get to that next level. Now they're at that level. In order to get to the next level, which is the 11th house, the ambition to either compete against everybody else in the corporate environment or be of service, let's say in a spiritual community or even in a corporate environment. Actually, the ones who really rise more easily are ones that can find a way to be of service, even in a corporate environment, rather than to be a cutthroat, ruthless competitor. Because the cutthroat, ruthless competitor might get to that next level, but they're not going to get much higher because they will be cutting the throats of people down here who might wind up here, or the people above them will notice their ruthless cutthroat nature. So we actually, even on a corporate level, we wind up advancing because of our capacity to be of service in the 11th house, not just a raw, blind ambition. The 11th house is where it's our collective identity and the community that is created. Now, again, within the community, we can be cooperative or we can be competitive. We can be backstabbing. And again, we might get that next level promotion, but it usually tops out because we're seen as not being so cooperative and we're not making many friends on the way up, so to speak. So the 10th and 11th house, again, are very connected in this way. I often teach them together now because, again, one is the power you have that you're willing to use again, in the corporate sense, let's say, if you're willing to use it because you can see how, boy, this would be so much better if we could do this, and you become innovative, visionary. It would be so much better if maybe we could do this and da 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 da. That kind of person, that kind of ambition even, winds up getting recognized and promoted, because the ambition is to be more collaborative, more collective. So we all win. And those people often get promoted much more quickly, even than those who have degrees and whatnot, because they're working in a system and they're showing their ambition to be of service to a larger cause. Of course, this is also the personal transformation from a kind of corporate sense of duty and responsibility to the one I was talking about a second ago, of work in service of something higher, whether it's at your job or not, just putting forth the energy in service to something higher. And ultimately, it doesn't have to be a guru. It can be your community. People become community organizers or something. Sometimes these things, you're not paid for these things. You do it because you feel like you can do it and you can facilitate, and you want to align with something higher and more cooperative and bring people together around a larger cause. That's the highest quality of the 11th house. And it's where we see ourselves in a collective way. So it's not just me and my personal happiness. Again, this is actually opposite the 5th house. Remember, the 5th house is my personal creativity, even connected to things like my children and all like that. 5th house. 11th house is our collective engagement, our collective joy, right? So this is how these houses also work to clarify their opposite. So again, 10th and 11th houses are very much the sort of public, the power, the confidence to make an impact, and then what we do with the power we have, right? Like I have a certain amount of power to teach or do whatever it is. I could get more power if, to do this thing or to do that thing. I could use it however, and you see how someone uses the power they have. Do they abuse the power they have for their own gain and benefit and ambition? Again, that's where the 10th house and 11th house, where you see someone who just abuses their power to get more for themselves, to push others down and to win. That's the negative quality of the 11th house, where we're not cooperative, we're just competitive, and we're driven by just our ego desires. And again, that kind of hyper materialistic greed, competition among like billionaires, or even just in a smaller sense where people compete. By the way, you get people even in these organizations, and I keep it real here. And I'll tell you, you wouldn't think this is the case, but if you've ever spent time in spiritual communities or whatever, even like, in my Alma community, you have all these people being of service in the 10th house, wanting to serve humanity in the 11th house as a concept. But then they start doing it and they got that 10th house power and they're like, I'm in charge of the blah, blah, blah. And you'll see the ego rears its head. So anytime people start to organize like this, then their egos come out. Like, I'm here, like they are there trying to serve and make an impact through service, but then they can get very attached to their power as someone doing a certain job. I'm in charge of the dishwashing, so I'm okay, that's fine. But you'll see people start getting very territorial and weird and mean, and the 11th house, the competition, competing against the other people who are doing the service. It's hilarious, really, on some level. I mean, and by the way, you hear about this, people go to the AMA programs, and the biggest complaints you ever hear about doesn't have to do with AMA, doesn't even have to do with the people there. It often has to do with the people who are doing Seva. By the way, I'm not trying to criticize them, because again, it's tough and they work a lot. But again, just how sometimes they can just be like, I'm in charge of the thing. And I do it too. I mean, I'm not saying I abuse it, but like one of the things that I do is bookstore security. So I'll stand there with a vest and I'll like look around, like a cop. You can imagine me as like a bookstore security cop, right? Because people steal things, particularly in the public programs. And I'll sit there and, I'm sitting there watching, and anytime that I have to say something to someone, I figured out a way to be very friendly about just letting them know that I'm watching. Never accuse anybody of anything. But if I see people that look sketchy, I'll go up to them and just talk to them in a very friendly but way that let them know that I'm watching them, right? That there are people really watching, right? So I would say I'm not bad at that sort of abuse, but the ones that like travel and are in charge of departments, man, they can be very pushy, very grouchy, and at times just in a bad mood and spread it. Even in that context, like the ego comes out, and the big thing is, well, I'm in charge of you put somebody in charge of something, I don't care what it is, this thing can come out, this nature to compete and dominate. And that domination stuff is 10th house. I'm the boss, the domination. Okay. And then the 11th house is like the competition, right? Like the kind of jealousy of the one who is ahead of them. So then the last house, and when you get planets in the 10th house, in the 12th house, it's that it says spirituality, subconscious, positive is intuitive, spiritual, compassionate, negative is escapist, secretive, self-sabotaging. Yeah, the 12th house is opposite of the 6th house, where there's all those problems in life. The 12th house, we want to escape from them. And again, it can be difficult because we escape into things that are complicated, right? Escapism means we're sort of tuning out all of the world, tuning out the pain and the problems and the pressures of the world, because it's too much for us. But it's also where we can be tuning in to our true nature that I talked about in the 1st house. So there's a continuum. Planets in the 12th house feed that 1st house. Remember the things I was talking about here, that true identity, where there's integrity. We really get that integrity by going deeper into the 1st house, which is your body and identity, and connecting with that deeper wisdom. But the way to do that is the healthy qualities of the 12th house, is to escape from the false identity by tuning in and surrendering, letting go of the false identity. And you see it comes after the 11th house. The 11th house is all of the noise and clamor and ambition and people, and the world is like blah, which it is, right? Again, I use the AMA as an example. Even if you go to an AMA program, it's people everywhere, and there's this and there's that and it's blah, blah, blah. It's so much. And the world is just full of like so many people and so many things and so much possibility. It's stressful. And the 12th house, we just want to escape from it. So how can we escape? Well, we can get drunk. We can get high. We can just watch TV. We can watch videos, get on the internet, just tune out. And I'm just going to escape from all this into my own world. So the 12th house has that quality of solitude in a positive or in a negative way, where there's escapism or escaping into the true reality. Escaping from the false reality into the true reality is also possible. That's what meditation is. And it comes by surrendering and letting go willfully. So rather than letting go and escaping in an unhealthy way from our false identity and from our ignorance through the ego, instead of trying to escape from that because we feel weird and anxious and we don't know what to do because we don't know who we are, it's a very simple thing. We can escape to that true nature in healthy ways through meditation by just surrendering, letting go. The thing with the 12th house, also like with the sign of Pisces, is the thing to do is actually nothing, is to surrender. It's all of our doing that's the problem. We're doing a bunch of things. So rather than do something else, like now I'm going to do this to escape, and I'm going to watch the TV or do the thing or distract, do nothing. The 12th house is the undoing, the surrendering, which is the hardest thing. So again, even the reason I talk about things like we're the ego and we're this and we're that, we don't realize that we are mostly attached to an absolute falsehood, that we're not the physical body, we're not the emotions, we're not this. And it's not just an intellectual thing to believe. All right, I believe that. But that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if we believe it. Our whole identity revolves around being attached for the most part. And only when there's meditation and surrender and letting go is there truth. And then once we do that, and again, we don't have to completely, we can just tune into that truth though, in small doses. Even right now, you're sitting there, you can just feel the energy move inward, feel that silence that's within, connect with the breath. You can do it anytime, actually, anytime. You can connect with that at any time because it's always there, because your true nature is always there. It's just a shift of focus. And so that's really what authentic spirituality is. It's actually not a big thing. It's a little thing. It's the smallest of things, actually. I remember when I started meditating when I wasn't even 20 years old yet. In fact, I just barely turned 19. And I was reading the books of, he became known as Osho, but back then he was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. And reading this, they were called the Book of the Secrets. And I remember reading this. And this is something that he said is like, people make a big deal. It's the littlest thing. It's a little trick. It's so small that you overlook it. It's not some big thing that you have to attain. You don't have to go to the Himalayas to find what's right there all the time. You're breathing, you're alive, you're present. You just have to tune into it. But tuning into it means you have to be willing to let go of the thing you're doing. You're riding that train of thought. You're cooperating with all of the illusion constantly. You're like, oh, this is me. Now I'm this, now this, now this, now this. It's always going outward. You just need to stop it. Just break it for a while, or for just at different moments, and just let the energy go back in and surrender and let go. Escape from that in a healthy way. That's what the 12th house is. But again, it's very confusing energy because it can really just program us for unhealthy escapism. I don't know this ascendant here, so I don't have any of these charts. But again, the unhealthy program is to always be going into that place that is sort of confusing. And the thing about the 12th house is that we are confused about the stories that are going on. We can run a lot of dreams, and our life revolves around all these scenarios. Like if people have planets in the 12th house, then the nature of those planets and what those planets rule and all of that becomes this kind of very confusing dream-like state. And we actually even really lie to ourselves and wind up lying to others and things like that because we're confused. And so we're living in this confusing state. So we don't speak clearly. We don't tell the truth. We don't realize we're not telling the truth because we're just kind of in our fantasy world. So even if a person doesn't drink or get high or anything, and even if they meditate a lot, I know quite a few people who have a couple planets in the 12th house and they're, quote, spiritual. And they go to India and with gurus and all like that. and they live clean lives. They don't, again, they don't get into escapism like this thing or that thing, but they're constantly in an escapist mode. They're constantly in a sort of dream world. And you get around them, and if you're clear, like if you're present, like I'm very present, so I'm very alert to how people are acting. So I notice, again, I have all these planets in the first house. You're actually very present and notice. Doesn't mean you're right about everything, but you're just noticing people's behavior. Like the thing I was talking about earlier. You see the phony smiling and the like people looking around like, oh yeah, hi. Oh yeah, huh? And you see people like phony smiling, looking away, and to someone who's present, it's all just phony, personality behavior. And I'm like, all right, I don't know what's going on, but so many people I know who have a lot of planets in the 12th house, especially that's often what you'll often see them sitting there. They're kind of by themselves, like in their own world. They'll be kind of sitting there like this, and then you come up and they'll be like, and right away they put on the like, the kind of like this. It's almost manic looking sort of performance where they're like, oh yeah, like over gesticulating and putting on the kind of facade because they're kind of in some kind of thing, and now they're being snapped into engagement in the first house. And then you'll leave and you'll see they'll kind of be sitting there again, like just kind of in their own world. Sometimes maybe it's a world of meditation. Sometimes it's not. It could be very dark, could be very much in their own fantasy world, right? So again, this is what the 12th house can be. Any planets there have this kind of affectation where they're, like if it's Venus, then their agreements with other people and the sense of enjoyment and happiness that Venus rules goes into this very confusing area where they're very confused about why people react the way they do to them. And a lot of illusions around, often that it's the other person or whatever it might be. The sun there, their own power is kind of very confusing or, whatever. So again, planets in the 12th house have that kind of confusing affectation, but also can lead the person into that meditation because they're ready to kind of let go of the world, themselves, their identity. But notice this about 12th house, if you know people with that or you have it, this kind of where again that it's particularly like there's a bunch of planets in the 12th, but there's nothing in the first house ruler isn't very present, then you could really see that sort of, and I see a lot of this from being like even around Amma and knowing a lot of people's charts. A lot of my observations come from this because I know a lot of people's charts and I observe and I'm like, wow, I can really see that. I can really see that planet showing up here with this person and their behavior and this and that. So anyway, folks, that's the class here. We've gone 2.5 hours here, and there's only a few people here. If somebody did want to ask a question or whatever, make a statement, you can do that. But other than that, I hope this was a helpful group of classes where just tried to streamline the planets as these evolutionary channels that are very distinct, have this evolutionary process through these planets. They feel a certain way in the signs. And then they show up when planets are in those houses. The houses are going to show the field of energy into which those planets are being revealed in life. They pop out and show up in this area of life. So anyway, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.